What's the most badass way you've ever dealt with an angry stranger? I was walking out of the grocery store when this teenage girl ran up to me looking terrified. Please, I need your help. I know I sound crazy, but my dad is coming here right now. He's going to hurt me. I need someone to protect me. She was maybe 16, holding a positive pregnancy test. He's been tracking my phone. He'll be here in 20 minutes. I stopped. What's going on? She showed me a text from Dad. If you're actually pregnant, I'll put you in the hospital. I mean that. I couldn't leave her. We sat on the curb outside the store. Why is your dad acting like this? I asked. She pulled up her sleeves. Bruises covered her wrists. Old ones in different colors. Yellow, purple, green. He does this, she said quietly. My older sister got pregnant when she was 17. My dad found out and beat her so badly she lost the baby, in our living room. I was 13. I watched it happen. He said he'll do worse to me. My stomach dropped. Her phone buzzed. Text from Layla. Where are you? Dad's breaking things downstairs. I'm locked in my room. Please come home. That's my little sister, the girl said, starting to cry. She's 13. When I'm not home, he takes it out on her. Another text from Layla. He's yelling at Mom, asking where you are. I'm scared. The girl showed me Ring camera footage, her dad throwing furniture, screaming. Her mom backed into a corner, terrified. This was yesterday, she said. He lost his job 3 weeks ago. He's been getting worse. Last week he punched a hole in my bedroom door because I didn't answer him fast enough. Her phone buzzed. 15 minutes since the last text. Dad, I know you're at the store. I'm coming there now. She started shaking. He'll be here in 10 minutes. 5 minutes later, another text. You're not responding. That's fine. I was hyperventilating now. 1 minute. Final text. I'm in the parking lot now. I see your little friend with you. He was referring to me. He's going to regret getting involved. A truck pulled in fast, tires squealing. The girl's whole body went rigid. That's him. Her dad got out. Big guy, red face, furious. He started walking over. The store manager noticed the commotion and came outside. Other shoppers stopped to watch. Her dad's hands were clenched into fists. Get in the truck. Now, he screamed. I stood up. She's not going anywhere with you. Who the hell are you? Someone who saw your texts. His face changed, realized his threats were visible. That's my daughter. Mind your business. He said he'd put me in the hospital, the girl said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I didn't say that. You texted it. I have proof. She held up her phone. Give me that phone, right now. No. The manager stepped forward. Sir, you need to calm down. She's my kid. This is none of your business. Then he moved. He lunged forward and grabbed the girl's arm, hard, yanked her toward his truck. She screamed. He was dragging her across the parking lot. She tried to pull away, but he was too strong. I ran. The manager ran, other people rushing over. He got her to his truck, threw the passenger door open, started shoving her inside. She grabbed the door frame with both hands. No! Please! Help me! Get in this truck! He was pushing her head down, trying to force her in. He's going to kill me! She screamed. Someone please! I grabbed his arm. The manager grabbed the girl from the other side. 3 other shoppers helping now, all of us pulling her away. Her dad wouldn't let go. His fingers dug into her arm. We pulled harder. Finally, I decided enough was enough and punched him, hard as I could in the jaw. His grip broke instantly as he stumbled back, and the girl fell backward into us. Everyone stood there breathing hard, 20 people with phones out, recording everything. An older woman got out of the nearby car. She'd been in the passenger seat the whole time, waiting for the right moment. It was his mother. What did you do? She said. Mom, stay out of this. Let me see what you texted her. The girl held up her shaking phone. The grandmother read the texts. Her face went cold. You threatened to hospitalize your own daughter? After what you did to Becca? That was different. You beat Becca until she lost her baby. I saw the bruises. She looked at the fresh marks on the girl's arm. I'm not letting you do this again. Police cars pulled in, sirens everywhere. Everyone started talking at once. He tried to force her into his truck. Look at her arm. We have it on video. The cops looked at the bruises, the texts, the the videos. 20 witnesses. Sir, you're under arrest for assault and attempted kidnapping. They handcuffed him. He was yelling, "That's my daughter. This is bullcrap." The grandmother put her arm around the girl. "You're safe now. You're coming home with me." A week later, court papers arrived. The dad made bail. He's suing me for $500,000 for interfering with parental rights. His lawyer says I assaulted him first. There's a hearing scheduled. I saw him at the courthouse yesterday. He smiled at me. I should have just minded my business. I sat in my car outside the courthouse for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home. My hands wouldn't stop shaking on the steering wheel. The lawsuit papers were on my passenger seat. $500,000. I kept reading that number over and over. $500,000 for helping someone. For stopping a guy from dragging his kid into his truck. I tried to start the car 3 times before I could actually do it. My phone rang when I was halfway home, my wife asking where I was. I pulled over because I couldn't focus on driving and talking at the same time. I told her about the lawsuit. She went quiet, really quiet, like she was holding her breath. Then she asked if we needed a lawyer. I realized I had no idea how to answer that. I didn't know anything about lawsuits or defending yourself or what any of this meant. I told her I'd figure it out. She said okay, but her voice sounded wrong, scared. I got home and she was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop. She'd already started looking up lawyers. We spent the whole evening searching online. Every website I clicked on made my stomach hurt worse. Consultation fees ranged from $200 to $500 just to talk to someone. Retainer fees started at $5,000 and went up from there. Way up. One lawyer's website said civil defense cases average between $15,000 and $50,000. Another site said complex cases can cost over $100,000. I opened our savings account on my phone. We had $18,000 saved. For emergencies. For our kids' college funds someday. For a down payment on a better house. Not for this. Not nearly enough for this. My wife asked what we were going to do. I didn't have an answer. I kept thinking about that smile. The father standing in the courthouse hallway smiling at me like he'd already won. Like he knew exactly what he was doing. Knew I couldn't afford to fight this. I barely slept that night. Kept running numbers in my head. Kept imagining losing our house. Losing everything because I punched someone who was hurting his kid. The next morning, my phone rang at 8. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice asking if I was the person involved in the grocery store incident last week. I said yes. She introduced herself as Rachel Harrington. Said she was a lawyer who'd read about what happened in the news. She wanted to meet with me for free to talk about the case and what my options were. I asked why she'd do that. She said because she handles cases like this, and the father's lawsuit looked like classic intimidation. She gave me her office address and said she had time that afternoon if I wanted to come by. I went. I didn't have any other choice. Rachel's office was in a small building near downtown. Not fancy, but professional. Clean desk, law books on shelves, framed certificates on the wall. She was maybe 40, short dark hair, glasses. She shook my hand and told me to sit down and tell her everything. So I did. The whole story from the beginning. The girl running up to me, the texts, the bruises, her dad showing up, the fight in the parking lot, the arrest, all of it. Rachel listened without interrupting once, just took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. She said the father's lawsuit was aggressive, but she'd seen worse attempts at intimidation through the legal system. Said guys like him use the courts to punish people who stand up to them. She pulled out the lawsuit papers I'd brought and read through them carefully. Then she explained that his case was weak. Really weak. I was defending someone from immediate harm. That's legally protected. It's called defense of others. But she said even weak cases can cost tens of thousands of dollars to defend. That's what he's counting on. That I'll be too scared of the cost to fight back. That I'll try to settle just to make it go away. She asked about my finances. I told her about our savings. About $18,000. She nodded like she'd heard this before. Then she made me an offer. She'd take my case for a reduced rate. Payment plans if I needed them. Her husband Wallace was a private investigator. He could help gather more evidence from the witnesses. Track down the people who recorded everything. Between the two of them, they thought they could get this dismissed before trial. Maybe even get the father sanctioned for filing a frivolous lawsuit. I asked how much it would cost. She said probably $5,000 to $8,000 total if things went smoothly. More if it got complicated. but she'd work with me on payments. I sat there trying to decide. $5,000 was still a lot, but it was better than $50,000. Better than $100,000. Better than losing everything. I told her, okay, let's do it. We signed the paperwork right there. She had me sign a retainer agreement and a payment plan form. Then she pulled out her phone and started making calls immediately. Right in front of me. Calling the grocery store, asking for the manager. Asking about security footage. Asking for contact information for employees who were working that day. She made 6 calls in 15 minutes, writing down names and numbers, telling people her investigator husband would be reaching out. Wallace started working the next day. Rachel called me 3 days later with an update. Wallace had tracked down 12 of the 20 witnesses who recorded the incident. Most of them were willing to provide statements. Some had already sent their video footage. She said the videos were good. Really good. Multiple angles showing the father dragging his daughter across the parking lot. Showing me and others trying to pull her away. Showing me only punching him after he refused to let go. The footage clearly showed the father as the aggressor. Showed his daughter screaming for help. Showed her grabbing the door frame, trying not to be forced into the truck. Rachel said this was exactly what we needed. A week after I hired her, Rachel filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit. She walked me through it on the phone. The motion argued that I acted in defense of another person who was in immediate danger. She attached 12 witness statements. Attached video evidence from 8 different phones showing the father's aggression and his daughter's visible distress. Attached photos of the bruises on the girl's arms. Attached screenshots of the threatening texts the father had sent. The motion was 30 pages long. Rachel said it was thorough because she wanted the judge to see exactly what happened. Wanted him to understand this wasn't just a parent trying to take his kid home. This was an abuser trying to hurt someone and getting stopped. She filed it electronically that afternoon. Said we'd probably hear back in 2 to 3 weeks about a hearing date. 2 weeks later, Rachel called saying the father's attorney filed his response. I drove to her office to read it. Dorian McCallum's argument was simple. He claimed I escalated everything by punching his client when I could have just called the cops and waited. The response said the father was exercising his parental rights, and I had no legal authority to interfere physically. Rachel sat across from me while I read through the 12 pages. She pointed to specific sections where Dorian argued the father was simply trying to take his daughter home and my actions caused the real harm. The response included a medical report showing the father had a bruised jaw and minor facial swelling. Dorian was claiming assault and asking the judge to award his client damages for medical bills and emotional distress on top of the original $500,000. Rachel flipped to the last page. She showed me where Dorian requested the court sanction me for filing a frivolous motion to dismiss. I felt sick reading it. Rachel closed the folder and said we expected this kind of aggressive response. She explained that Dorian was trying to intimidate me into settling, but our evidence was stronger than anything in his filing. 3 days after reading that response, my phone rang from an unknown number. The woman on the line introduced herself as Leah Whitehead, the prosecutor handling the criminal case against the father. She said she needed to meet with me because my testimony would be crucial for the trial. We scheduled a meeting at her office for the following Tuesday. Leah's office was in the courthouse building, 4th floor. I signed in at security and took the elevator up. Her office was small with stacks of case files covering every surface. She shook my hand and cleared off a chair for me to sit. Leah got right to business. She pulled out a thick folder with the father's name on it and started walking me through the criminal charges. Assault, attempted kidnapping, child endangerment. She explained that the text messages were powerful evidence because they showed premeditation and clear threats. The witness videos proved he physically tried to force his daughter into his truck against her will. Leah said my testimony would tie everything together because I could describe the girl's fear, the bruises I saw, and the father's violent behavior in the parking lot. She asked me to walk through the entire incident step by step. I described seeing the girl approach me, reading the threatening texts, sitting with her while we waited, watching the father arrive and immediately become aggressive. Leah took notes while I talked. She stopped me when I got to the part about punching him. She asked exactly what was happening right before I threw the punch. I explained the father was dragging his daughter toward his truck. She was screaming for help. He was forcing her inside, and she was grabbing the door frame, trying to resist. Leah nodded and wrote something down. She said that detail was important because it showed I only used force after he was actively kidnapping her, and she was begging for help. Then Leah brought up the father's lawsuit against me. She said it was a common intimidation tactic that abusers use to silence witnesses and victims. She'd seen it dozens of times in domestic violence cases. The abuser files a civil lawsuit, hoping the witness will get scared and refuse to testify or change their story to make the lawsuit go away. Leah looked me straight in the eye and said she needed me to stay strong and tell the truth regardless of the civil case. I promised her I would. She said the criminal trial was scheduled for about 8 weeks out, and she'd be in touch as we got closer to prep my testimony more. I left her office feeling better about the criminal case, but still worried about the lawsuit. A week after meeting with Leah, Rachel called with an update. The girl's name was Riley. She was staying with her grandmother and doing better according to her court-appointed advocate. His name was Xavier Barnes, and he worked for Child Protective Services. Xavier had told Rachel that Riley wanted to thank me personally for helping her that day, but her therapist thought it was better to wait until after both trials were over. The therapist was worried that contact between us might complicate things legally or emotionally for Riley, while everything was still ongoing. Rachel said Riley was in therapy twice a week and was getting the help she needed. Her grandmother had full temporary custody, and the younger sister was also staying there now. The mother had moved out of the house and was living separately from the father. Xavier told Rachel that Riley was planning to keep her baby, and her grandmother was supporting that decision. Hearing she was safe and getting help made me feel like the whole mess was worth it. 3 weeks after the grocery store incident, I got a letter in the mail from Dorian McCallum's law office. I opened it thinking it was more legal papers for the lawsuit. Instead, it was a single-page offer. Dorian was proposing to drop the entire lawsuit against me if I agreed not to testify in the criminal case against his client. The letter said this was a good-faith settlement offer that would save both sides time and money. It said I could walk away from everything with no financial liability if I just declined to participate in the criminal trial. I read it twice trying to understand what I was seeing. Then I called Rachel immediately. She told me to scan the letter and email it to her right away. I did. She called back 10 minutes later and said this was witness tampering. Dorian had just committed a crime by trying to get me to refuse to testify in exchange for dropping the lawsuit. Rachel said she was reporting this to both the judge in the civil case and to Leah Whitehead. She sounded excited in a weird way, like Dorian had just made a huge mistake that would help our case. The next day, Rachel called to say the judge in the civil case scheduled an emergency hearing for that Friday. He was not happy about the attempted witness intimidation. Rachel said the judge sent a warning to Dorian that any further contact with me outside proper legal channels would result in sanctions. She told me to be at the courthouse Friday morning at 9. The hearing was short. The judge called both attorneys to the bench before we even sat down. I could see him talking, but couldn't hear what he was saying. Dorian kept shaking his head and gesturing with his hands. Rachel stood there calmly. After 5 minutes, they came back to their tables. The judge looked annoyed. He said on the record that he had reviewed the letter sent to me and found it inappropriate. Dorian immediately stood up and argued it was a legitimate settlement offer. The judge cut him off and said offering to drop a lawsuit in exchange for refusing to testify in a criminal case was not a legitimate settlement. It was witness tampering. Dorian tried to argue more, but the judge raised his hand. He ordered that the father and his attorney were to have no contact with me directly or through any third parties except in official court proceedings. He said if he received any reports of further contact, he would consider sanctions, including referring Dorian to the state bar. The hearing ended, and we walked out. Rachel was smiling. She said that went even better than she hoped, because now the judge was suspicious of everything Dorian filed. 2 days later, Rachel called with the trial schedule. The criminal trial was set for 6 weeks out. My motion to dismiss the civil lawsuit would be heard 2 weeks before the criminal trial. Rachel said the timing actually helped us because all the criminal evidence would be fresh and available. She could use the same witness statements and videos for both cases. She explained that if we won the motion to dismiss, the father's lawsuit would be over before the criminal trial even started. That would remove the intimidation factor completely, and I could testify freely. I asked what happened if we lost the motion. Rachel said then we'd go to trial on the civil case, but she was confident we'd win either way because the evidence was so strong. I went back to work the next Monday, trying to focus on my regular job. My coworkers knew about the situation because it had been on the local news. Most people were supportive and said I did the right thing. but a few made comments that bothered me. One guy in accounting said I should have just called the cops and let them handle it instead of getting involved. Another coworker said she would never put herself at risk like that for a stranger, because you never know what kind of legal trouble you might end up in. I tried to ignore the comments, but they stuck in my head. That Wednesday, my boss called me into his office. He closed the door and asked me to sit down. He said he needed to know if the legal situation was going to affect my job performance. I told him it wouldn't. I explained that I had court dates scheduled, but they were all outside work hours, or I could use personal time. My boss looked uncomfortable. He said the company couldn't be associated with ongoing legal controversies. He mentioned that clients might have concerns if they found out about the lawsuit. I felt my face get hot. I told him I was sued for helping someone who was attacked. He nodded and said he understood that, but he needed to make sure it wouldn't become a distraction or reflect poorly on the company. I left his office angry and worried that my job might be in danger on top of everything else. That Friday evening, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. An older woman's voice came through, tired but steady. She introduced herself as Riley's grandmother and said she wanted to thank me for what I did at the store. Her voice cracked a little when she said Riley was safe now, living with her and starting to heal. She mentioned Riley was seeing a therapist named Mara Dooley who works with kids from violent homes. The grandmother said Mara was helping Riley process everything that happened and that having someone believe her and protect her made a huge difference. I didn't know what to say, except that I was glad Riley was okay. The grandmother thanked me again before hanging up, and I sat there feeling a little less terrible about the whole situation. While I was processing that call, Wallace was digging through public records looking for anything that might help our case. He called Rachel late that same night with something big. He found an arrest record for Riley's father from 8 years ago, domestic violence against his wife. The charges got dropped because Riley's mom refused to testify, probably out of fear, but the police report was still on file. Wallace read parts of it to Rachel over the phone. The responding officers described serious injuries on the mother: bruising on her face and arms, a split lip, marks on her neck consistent with choking. The report noted that the couple's children were home during the incident and likely witnessed at least part of the assault. The father had been arrested and held overnight before the wife declined to press charges, and he was released. The next morning, Rachel called me to her office to go over this new information. She spread the police report across her desk and walked me through what it meant for our case. This wasn't just one incident at a grocery store. This was a pattern, a history of violence against his family going back years. Rachel added the prior arrest to our court filings, along with a detailed argument about why it mattered. She wrote that I had every reason to believe Riley was in immediate danger based on her father's documented history of violence, his threatening texts, and Riley's visible injuries. The pattern showed this wasn't a man who lost his temper once. This was someone who repeatedly hurt the people in his family and got away with it because his victims were too scared to hold him accountable. A week later, Dorian filed a motion trying to get the prior arrest excluded from both the civil lawsuit and the criminal case. His argument was that an 8-year-old dropped charge had nothing to do with what happened in the parking lot. He claimed it was prejudicial and irrelevant because the charges were never prosecuted. Rachel filed an opposition brief the same day. She argued that pattern evidence of domestic violence is absolutely relevant when determining whether someone was in immediate danger. The judge scheduled a hearing on the motion for the following Monday. Rachel said this was important because if the judge allowed the prior arrest as evidence, it would seriously damage the father's credibility and show the jury he had a history of exactly this kind of violence. At the hearing, Dorian stood before the judge and argued that the prior arrest was too old and that dismissed charges shouldn't be used against his client. The judge listened without much expression. Then Rachel stood and calmly explained that pattern evidence is specifically allowed in domestic violence cases because abuse is rarely a one-time thing. She pointed out that the police report described injuries similar to what Riley showed in the parking lot and that the father's own mother mentioned his previous assault on daughter Becca. The judge took about 30 seconds to make his decision. He denied Dorian's motion completely. He said pattern evidence of domestic violence is absolutely relevant to determining if Riley was in immediate danger and that the prior arrest would be allowed in both cases. Dorian's face went red, but he didn't argue further. 4 weeks after the incident, I walked into the courthouse for the hearing on my motion to dismiss the lawsuit. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Plain walls, wooden benches, an American flag in the corner. The father sat across the aisle with Dorian beside him. He wore a button-down shirt and khakis, probably trying to look respectable. He kept his eyes forward and refused to look at me even once. Rachel sat next to me with a thick folder of documents and her laptop ready. A few other people sat in the gallery. I recognized Wallace in the back row. The bailiff called the court to order and the judge entered. He was maybe 60 with gray hair and reading glasses. He settled into his chair and asked Rachel to present our motion first. Rachel stood and walked the judge through everything in careful detail. She started with the timeline, explaining how Riley approached me in the parking lot already showing signs of abuse. She displayed photos of Riley's bruises on a screen, pointing out the different colors indicating injuries from different days. Then she showed the judge the threatening texts from Riley's father, reading them aloud so their violence was clear. She played 3 different video recordings that witnesses had taken. The first showed the father grabbing Riley's arm and dragging her toward his truck. The second showed Riley screaming and grabbing the door frame, trying to resist. The third showed me and others pulling Riley away, while the father refused to let go. Rachel pointed out that I only punched him after he had physically assaulted his daughter in front of dozens of witnesses, and she was begging for help. She argued that any reasonable person would have intervened to protect someone in that situation. When Rachel finished, Dorian stood to present the father's side. He argued that I used excessive force and that the father was simply trying to take his daughter home. He claimed the texts were taken out of context, that Riley has a history of being dramatic and lying to get attention, and that family discipline matters should stay within the family. He said I had no right to physically assault his client regardless of the circumstances, and that calling the police would have been the appropriate response. He tried to paint the father as a concerned parent, dealing with a rebellious pregnant teenager who was making bad choices. The whole argument felt weak and desperate, like he knew he didn't have much to work with but had to say something. The judge stopped Dorian mid-sentence and asked him directly if he was claiming the bruises on Riley's arms were fabricated or self-inflicted. Dorian hesitated. You could see him trying to figure out how to answer without making things worse. He finally said he wasn't making that specific claim, but that the cause of the bruises wasn't definitively established in the evidence. The judge's expression changed. He looked annoyed. He asked Dorian if the father caused those bruises. Dorian said he couldn't confirm that without more investigation. The judge leaned forward slightly and asked if Dorian had read the police reports from the arrest. Rachel immediately stood and objected. She said the father admitted to causing the bruises during his police interview after the arrest. She pulled up the interview transcript on her laptop and read the relevant section aloud. The officer had asked the father directly about the marks on Riley's arms, and he said she bruises easily, and he might have grabbed her too hard a few days before. Rachel looked at Dorian and asked if he was really claiming he hadn't read his own client's police interview. The judge looked even more annoyed now. He told Dorian that he expected attorneys in his courtroom to be familiar with the basic facts of their cases, and that he didn't appreciate arguments that contradicted documented evidence. The hearing wrapped up 20 minutes later. The judge said he would take the motion under advisement and issue a ruling within 2 weeks. He warned both sides that he expected professionalism and honesty in his courtroom, looking directly at Dorian when he said it. Then he dismissed us. Rachel packed her files and we walked out together. She was smiling slightly. She said that went even better than she hoped, because now the judge was clearly suspicious of everything Dorian filed. The fact that he tried to dispute something the father had already admitted to in a police interview made him look either incompetent or dishonest. Either way, it helped our case. I felt cautiously hopeful walking to my car, but I knew 2 weeks of waiting would feel like forever. The next week crawled by with painful slowness. I checked my phone constantly, waiting for updates from Rachel about the judge's decision. Work became a blur of distraction. My coworkers asked how the hearing went, and I gave vague answers because I honestly didn't know if things had gone well or not. Rachel called on Wednesday to say she'd heard nothing yet from the court, which was normal but frustrating. She reminded me that judges have full caseloads, and our motion was just one of many they're reviewing. That Friday afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was Leah, the prosecutor handling the criminal case. She asked if I had a few minutes to talk, and I pulled over into a parking lot because her tone sounded important. Riley's mother had finally agreed to testify in the criminal trial. Leah explained that the mother had been terrified of her husband for years, but seeing Riley safe with the grandmother had given her courage to speak up. She was ready to tell the court about 15 years of abuse, the escalating violence, the fear that controlled their household. Her testimony would be powerful because she could describe the pattern of behavior, the way he'd beaten Becca 4 years ago, the constant threats, the atmosphere of terror he created. Leah said having the mother testify changed everything because it showed this wasn't just one incident in a parking lot, but part of a long history of family violence. 2 days later, Leah called again with more news. Becca had also agreed to testify about what happened when she got pregnant at 17. She was willing to describe in detail how her father beat her in their living room while 13-year-old Riley watched, how she lost the baby that night in the hospital, how he told her it was her fault for getting pregnant. Leah's voice had an edge of satisfaction when she explained that having both the mother and older sister corroborate the pattern of violence would make the criminal case extremely strong. The defense couldn't claim this was an isolated incident or a misunderstanding when multiple family members were testifying about years of abuse. Meanwhile, Wallace had been busy tracking down and interviewing the witnesses from the grocery store parking lot. He called me one evening to report on his progress. The store manager remembered everything clearly and was willing to testify that the father appeared completely out of control, that he'd watched the whole confrontation unfold and could confirm the father was the aggressor. Wallace had also found an off-duty nurse who'd been shopping that day and witnessed the incident. She'd noted specific details that would help our case. She remembered that Riley looked genuinely terrified, not just upset or dramatic like a teenager having a fight with her parent. She'd noticed Riley's hands protecting her stomach in a way that suggested she was trying to shield her pregnancy. She'd seen the bruises on Riley's arms and recognized them as defensive wounds from someone grabbing her hard. Wallace said he had statements from 8 other witnesses, all telling the same story, all confirming that I'd only intervened physically after the father started dragging Riley toward his truck. 5 weeks after the parking lot incident, Rachel called with news about the judge's ruling. Her voice sounded different, excited. The judge had granted our motion to dismiss completely. He'd written a detailed order finding that I acted reasonably to protect someone in immediate danger, that the father's lawsuit was without merit, and that my actions were legally justified under the circumstances. Rachel read parts of the order to me over the phone. The judge had specifically noted the threatening texts, the visible bruises, the father's aggressive behavior, and the multiple witnesses who confirmed Riley was in distress and trying to escape. But the judge went even further than just dismissing the case. He'd ordered the father to pay my attorney fees as a sanction for filing what he called a baseless lawsuit intended to intimidate a witness in a criminal case. Rachel was thrilled because this almost never happens. Judges rarely sanction parties for filing lawsuits, even weak ones, but this judge had clearly seen through the intimidation attempt. He'd recognized that the father was trying to punish me for helping Riley and for being willing to testify against him. The attorney fees wouldn't cover everything, but they'd cover most of what I'd spent on Rachel and Wallace's work. I sat in my car after Rachel's call and felt something close to relief wash over me. The lawsuit was over. I wouldn't be bankrupted for helping someone. My savings would stay intact. The threat that had been hanging over me for weeks was gone. Rachel warned me that the father could try to appeal the judge's ruling, but given how strongly the judge had ruled in my favor, an appeal was unlikely to succeed. She said most appeals in cases like this fail because appellate courts give trial judges wide discretion on matters like this. 2 days later, Rachel called again with less good news. The father's attorney had filed a notice of appeal anyway. Rachel said it was probably just posturing, a last attempt to harass me or make me nervous. The appeal would take months to work through the system, and in the meantime, the criminal trial was moving forward. She told me not to worry too much about the appeal because Dorian was grasping at straws, and the appellate court would likely affirm the dismissal. The criminal trial was scheduled to begin in 10 days. Leah contacted me to set up another meeting to prepare my testimony. We met at her office on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 days before the trial was set to start. She walked me through what to expect in the courtroom, how to answer questions on direct examination and cross-examination, what Dorian might try to ask me. She reminded me to stick to what I actually observed and experienced that day. Don't speculate about what the father was thinking or planning. Just describe what I saw, what Riley said and did, what the father said and did, what happened when he grabbed her. Leah emphasized that my testimony needed to be clear and specific about the sequence of events. She wanted me to explain exactly when I decided to intervene physically, what I saw that made me believe Riley was in immediate danger, why I thought there wasn't time to just call the police and wait. She said Dorian would definitely challenge my decision to punch the father, so I needed to be prepared to explain that I only did that after he was actively forcing Riley into his truck and she was screaming for help. The trial began on a Monday morning in early November. I arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early because Leah had told me to get there with time to spare. The courtroom was more crowded than I expected when I walked in. Riley sat in the front row with her grandmother on one side and Xavier, her court advocate, on the other. Her mother sat a few seats away, looking nervous. Becca was there too, along with Riley's younger sister Layla. Several of the witnesses from the parking lot were scattered throughout the gallery. I noticed at least 3 people who looked like reporters, notebooks out, watching everything. The father sat at the defense table with Dorian, wearing a suit, looking calm and composed like this was just another day. He glanced back at the gallery once, and his eyes passed over me without any reaction. The judge entered through the side door, and everyone stood. He was older, gray hair, reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck. He sat down and told everyone else to sit. The bailiff called the case number and announced the charges. The judge looked at both attorneys and asked if they were ready to proceed. Leah stood and said the prosecution was ready. Dorian stood and said the defense was ready. The judge told Leah to begin her opening statement. She walked to the center of the courtroom and faced the jury, 12 people sitting in 2 rows, watching her carefully. She started by telling them this case was about a father who threatened to hospitalize his pregnant teenage daughter, then tried to force her into his truck when she asked a stranger for help. She showed them printed copies of the text messages, the threats about putting Riley in the hospital, the message about holding her head underwater, the final message saying he was in the parking lot and saw me with her. Leah walked the jury through what happened next, the father arriving at the store, him grabbing Riley's arm and dragging her across the parking lot, him trying to shove her into his truck while she screamed for help, multiple witnesses pulling her away from him. She told the jury they would hear from Riley's mother about 15 years of escalating violence, from Riley's older sister about being beaten so badly she lost her baby, from the police officers who arrested him, from witnesses who recorded everything on their phones. She said the evidence would show a clear pattern of abuse and violence and that Riley had every reason to fear for her safety that day. Leah spoke for maybe 20 minutes total. She didn't raise her voice or get dramatic. She just laid out the facts in order and let them speak for themselves. When she finished, she thanked the jury and sat down. The judge asked Dorian if he wanted to give his opening statement now or wait until after the prosecution's case. Dorian stood and said he would give it now. He walked to the same spot Leah had stood and looked at the jury. He started by saying, this was a case about a father trying to bring his troubled teenage daughter home safely. He said Riley had a history of behavioral problems and making poor choices. He claimed the father was concerned about her welfare when he learned she was pregnant at 16. Dorian acknowledged the text messages, but said they needed to be understood in context. He said the father was frustrated and scared for his daughter, and he used strong language he regretted, but he never intended to actually hurt her. He told the jury the father went to the store to talk to Riley and bring her home, not to harm her. He said the situation escalated because I got involved and made it physical. He claimed the father was simply trying to get his daughter into his vehicle when multiple adults attacked him. Dorian spent time talking about parental rights and how difficult it is to raise teenagers in modern times. He suggested Riley was manipulating the situation to avoid consequences for her pregnancy. He said the prosecution would present a one-sided story, but the defense would show the full picture of a family in crisis and a father who loved his daughter. When Dorian sat down, the judge called a 15-minute recess. I went to the bathroom and splashed water on my face. Riley's grandmother came over and asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, just nervous about testifying later. She squeezed my shoulder and said the truth would come out. When court resumed, Leah called her first witness. One of the police officers who responded to the scene walked to the witness stand. He was young, maybe late 20s, in his dress uniform. He took the oath and sat down. Leah asked him to describe what he observed when he arrived at the grocery store that day. The officer said he saw a large group of people in the parking lot, all talking at once and pointing at a man in handcuffs. The man was yelling that the situation was none of their business and demanding to be released. The officer said he spoke with multiple witnesses who all described the same sequence of events. The father had grabbed his daughter and tried to force her into his truck. She was screaming for help. Multiple people intervened to pull her away from him. The officer said he examined Riley's arm and saw fresh bruises where the father had grabbed her. He also saw older bruises on both her wrists in various stages of healing. Leah asked if Riley showed him anything else. The officer said she showed him text messages from her father threatening to put her in the hospital and to hold her head underwater. He said the father admitted sending the messages when questioned. Leah asked what the father's demeanor was like. The officer said he was aggressive and confrontational, showing no concern for his daughter's visible distress. He kept insisting he had the right to take his daughter home. When Dorian cross-examined the officer, he asked if anyone witnessed the father actually hitting Riley that day. The officer said no, but the father had been physically forcing her into his vehicle against her will. Dorian asked if the officer considered that the father might have just been trying to get his daughter away from a dangerous situation. The officer said that didn't match the evidence or witness statements. The father was the one creating the dangerous situation. Court adjourned for the day after the officer's testimony. The second day started with Riley's mother taking the stand. She looked nervous walking up there, hands shaking as she took the oath. Leah asked her to describe her marriage. She said she'd been married to the father for 22 years. She described him as controlling and quick to anger, especially when he felt disrespected or challenged. Leah asked her to describe specific incidents. She talked about him punching holes in walls during arguments, throwing furniture when things didn't go his way, grabbing her arm hard enough to leave bruises when she tried to walk away from fights. She said it got worse over the years. Small incidents became bigger ones. Yelling became shoving. Shoving became hitting. She described an incident 3 years ago when he slapped her across the face because dinner wasn't ready when he got home from work. Another time when he pushed her into a bookshelf because she questioned a purchase he made. She said she learned to stay quiet and not challenge him because it was safer that way. Leah asked about the incident with Becca 4 years ago. Riley's mother started crying. She said the father found out Becca was pregnant and lost control completely. He screamed at Becca, calling her terrible names. Then he started hitting her, punching her in the stomach and ribs. She tried to stop him, but he shoved her away. Riley, who was 13 then, tried to help her sister, and he backhanded her across the face. The beating lasted maybe 2 minutes, but it felt like forever. When he finally stopped, Becca was curled up on the floor bleeding. They took her to the hospital and she lost the baby that night. Leah asked why she didn't report it to police. She said she was terrified. He told her if she said anything to anyone, he would make sure she never saw her daughters again. She believed him. Leah asked about the weeks leading up to the grocery store incident. She said the father lost his job and his anger got much worse. He was home all day, drinking more, getting into rages over small things. When he found out Riley was pregnant, she knew it would be bad. She heard him making threats. She saw him tracking Riley's phone. She was afraid he would do to Riley what he did to Becca, or worse. When Dorian stood up to cross-examine her, he asked if she was exaggerating these stories to get back at her husband. She looked right at him and said she stayed silent for 15 years because she was scared. She was only speaking now because she couldn't let him hurt another daughter. Dorian asked why she never left if things were so bad. She said she had no job, no money, nowhere to go. He controlled everything. She was trapped. Dorian tried a few more questions, but she stayed calm and consistent. The judge called the lunch recess. After lunch, Leah called Becca to the stand. She was 21 now, wearing a simple dress, hair pulled back. She looked nervous, but determined. Leah asked her to describe what happened 4 years ago. Becca said she was 17 and found out she was pregnant. She was scared to tell her father, but knew she couldn't hide it. When she told him, he started screaming. Then he started hitting her. She described him punching her in the stomach repeatedly. She fell to the floor, and he kept hitting her. She said her 13-year-old sister Riley tried to pull him off, and he hit Riley too. She said her mother was crying and begging him to stop. When he finally did stop, she was bleeding and in terrible pain. Her mother took her to the hospital and she lost her baby that night. Leah asked how the hospital staff responded. Becca said they asked what happened and she lied. She said she fell down the stairs. She was too scared to tell the truth. Dorian asked her why she never pressed charges. Becca turned to look at the jury and said she was 17, terrified, and her father convinced her it was her fault for getting pregnant. She said he told her over and over that she deserved what happened. She believed him for a long time. She said it took years of therapy to understand that nothing she did justified being beaten until she lost her baby. Dorian tried asking more questions, but nothing changed what she said. The judge called afternoon recess, and I sat in the hallway thinking about everything I'd heard. 3 more witnesses testified after the break. The store manager went first, and described watching the whole thing unfold through the front windows. He said he saw the father grab Riley's arm and start dragging her, saw her fighting to get away, saw me and others running to help. He said it was obvious Riley didn't want to go with her father and was genuinely scared. A woman who'd been shopping with her kids testified next. She recorded the whole incident on her phone, and the video played for the jury on a big screen. You could hear Riley screaming for help, see the father forcing her toward his truck, watch me punch him only after he had her halfway into the vehicle. The third witness was an older man who'd been loading groceries into his car. He said he started recording when he heard the screaming, and his video showed the same thing from a different angle. All three videos made it crystal clear that the father was the one being violent, and Riley was trying to escape. The jury watched each video twice, leaning forward in their seats, and I could see some of them shaking their heads. The trial moved into day 4, and Riley was scheduled to testify. I got to court early and saw her in the hallway with Xavier sitting close by. She looked nervous, picking at her fingernails and bouncing her leg. Xavier kept talking to her quietly, probably trying to calm her down. When they called her to the stand, she walked slowly to the front and got sworn in. Leah started with easy questions about her age and where she went to the school. Riley's voice was quiet at first, but got stronger as she talked. She described growing up in her house, watching her dad get angry over small things, seeing him hit her mom when he didn't like dinner or when bills came in the mail. She said she learned early to stay out of his way when he was in a bad mood. Then Leah asked about the day Becca got beaten. Riley's hands started shaking, and Xavier leaned forward in his seat near the front row. She said she was 13 and came downstairs to find her dad hitting Becca over and over. She tried to pull him off, and he shoved her into the wall so hard she couldn't breathe for a minute. She watched her sister curl up on the floor bleeding and knew Becca lost the baby that night at the hospital. Riley said from that moment she was terrified of getting pregnant because she knew exactly what her dad would do. When she found out she was pregnant a few weeks before the grocery store, she didn't tell anyone for days. She was too scared. Her dad found the pregnancy test in her bathroom trash, and that's when the threat started. He sent her texts saying he'd put her in the hospital, that she'd regret being stupid, that he'd make sure she learned her lesson. She showed her mom the texts, but her mom said there was nothing they could do. They just had to keep him calm. The day of the grocery store incident, Riley said she knew he was coming for her. He'd been tracking her phone for months, and she couldn't go anywhere without him knowing. She saw his text saying he was on his way, and she panicked. She ran out of the store and saw me walking to my car. She didn't know me, but she was desperate for any adult who might help, because she knew if her dad got her alone, she'd end up like Becca or worse. Xavier had tears in his eyes listening to her talk. Leah asked why Riley believed her father's threats were real. Riley looked right at the jury and said she'd watched him beat her sister until she lost a baby, watched him hit her mom hundreds of times, felt his hands around her own throat twice when she talked back to him. She said she knew he meant every word of those texts because he'd already proved what he was capable of doing. When Leah finished, Dorian stood up for cross-examination. He was careful, keeping his voice gentle because he knew the jury liked Riley. He asked why she didn't call police or go to a shelter instead of asking a stranger for help. Riley said her dad would have tracked her phone to any location within minutes, and she didn't have time to figure out somewhere safe. He controlled everything in their house, including her phone plan. Dorian suggested maybe she was exaggerating how bad things were at home. Riley pulled up her sleeve and showed the jury bruises on her upper arm, 5 distinct finger marks where her dad had grabbed her 2 days before the grocery store. She said these bruises were from him dragging her down the hallway when she didn't answer a question fast enough. Dorian asked if she'd ever reported the abuse to teachers or other adults. Riley said she tried once in 8th grade and told a school counselor. The counselor called her dad in for a meeting and he was charming and calm, said Riley was going through a difficult phase and making up stories for attention. After that meeting, he beat her so badly she missed 3 days of school. She never told another adult until the day in the parking lot. Dorian didn't have much else to ask. He sat down and Leah said the prosecution rests. The judge looked at Dorian and asked if he had witnesses. Dorian called a neighbor who said the father was always friendly and helped him fix his fence once. The neighbor admitted he'd never been inside the family's house and didn't know anything about what happened behind closed doors. Then Dorian called a psychologist who talked about how stressful it is to be a parent and how people sometimes lose their temper under pressure. The psychologist never met the father and didn't address any of the actual evidence about the violence. Leah didn't even bother with much cross-examination because neither witness said anything that mattered. Day 5 started with closing arguments. Leah stood up and walked the jury through everything methodically. She showed the threatening texts again, played the videos again, pointed to photos of Riley's bruises. She reminded them about Becca's testimony, the mother's testimony, all the witnesses who saw the father dragging Riley toward his truck. She said this wasn't about parenting or discipline. It was about a violent man who beat one daughter until she lost her baby and was trying to do the same to another daughter. She said the father's actions that day were attempted kidnapping and assault, and the pattern of abuse in that house was child endangerment. She asked the jury to hold him accountable. Dorian's closing tried to make it about parental rights. He said the father was just trying to bring his daughter home, and things got out of hand in a stressful moment. He asked the jury to consider how they'd feel if their teenager was pregnant and they were trying to handle a family crisis. He suggested the father's texts were harsh, but came from a place of concern, not actual intent to harm. He said, "I escalated everything by getting involved and punching the father." The jury went out to deliberate around 11 in the morning. 6 hours passed. I sat in the hallway with my wife, not talking much, just waiting. Riley sat with her grandmother and Xavier. Her mom was there too, looking exhausted. Finally, around 5 in the afternoon, the bailiff came out and said the jury had a verdict. We all filed back into the courtroom and my heart was pounding, so hard I could hear it. The jury foreman stood up and read the verdict. Guilty on assault. Guilty on attempted kidnapping. Guilty on child endangerment. The father showed no reaction at all, just stared straight ahead like he didn't hear anything. Riley started crying, and her grandmother put an arm around her. The judge thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks out. He said the father would remain free on bail until then, but the restraining order protecting Riley and her family stayed in place. After the judge left, Leah came over and said the father was looking at serious prison time given the severity of the charges and the pattern of abuse. She seemed satisfied with the outcome. Outside the courthouse, Riley's grandmother found me near the parking lot. She hugged me hard and said I gave her granddaughter a chance at a safe life. She said Riley was doing better every day, going to therapy, making plans for the baby. She said she'd never forget what I did that day in the parking lot, and neither would Riley. I drove home that evening feeling like maybe all the stress and fear of the lawsuit had been worth it. The next morning, my phone started ringing before I even got to work. 3 different news stations wanted interviews about the verdict. I ignored the first 2 calls, but then Rachel texted me saying the media interest was expected and I should consider doing 1 interview to control the narrative. She said declining everything would make reporters dig harder for other angles, but doing 1 good interview would satisfy most of the interest. I called her back and asked which station she recommended. She said the local NBC affiliate had the most professional reputation and would likely handle it respectfully. I agreed to 1 interview scheduled for that afternoon at their studio. The reporter was a woman in her 30s who seemed genuinely interested in the case rather than just chasing drama. She asked about that day in the parking lot, what made me decide to help Riley, and whether I had any regrets about getting involved. I told her the truth, that I saw someone in danger and couldn't walk away, and that despite the lawsuit and all the stress, I'd make the same choice again. She asked what I hoped people would take away from the story. I said that when you see someone being hurt, especially a kid, you have to act even if it's uncomfortable or risky, because staying silent makes you part of the problem. The interview aired that evening and my phone blew up with messages from friends and co-workers saying they saw it. A few people I hadn't talked to in years reached out to say they were proud of me. It felt weird being recognized for something that just seemed like basic human decency. 2 weeks later, the sentencing hearing arrived. I sat in the same courtroom where the trial had happened, and Riley was there with her grandmother, Xavier, and her mom. The judge called Riley to the stand first for her impact statement. She looked nervous, but determined as she stood at the microphone. She talked about growing up in fear, never knowing when her dad would explode, watching her older sister get beaten so badly she lost her baby. She described the years of bruises she tried to hide at the school, the constant anxiety that kept her from sleeping, the way she learned to make herself small and quiet to avoid setting him off. She said finding out she was pregnant filled her with terror because she knew exactly what he would do based on what he did to Becca. Her voice shook when she talked about that day in the parking lot. how certain she was that he would hurt her badly, how grateful she was that someone actually helped her instead of looking away. She said she was still in therapy working through the trauma, but for the first time in her life, she felt safe, and she wanted the judge to make sure her dad couldn't hurt anyone else. Becca went next, and her statement was even harder to hear. She described being 17 and pregnant and scared, trying to tell her dad, and how he lost control immediately. She talked about the beating in graphic detail, the pain, waking up in the hospital and learning she'd lost the baby. She said she blamed herself for years, thought maybe she deserved it somehow, until therapy helped her understand that nothing justifies what he did. She said she still had nightmares about it, still struggled with relationships and trust, and she wanted her younger sisters to have a chance at a normal life without that kind of fear. Their mother testified last, speaking quietly about 15 years of abuse, the escalating violence, her own fear and shame about not protecting her daughters better. She said she stayed because he convinced her no one would believe her, that she had nowhere to go, that it was her fault for making him angry. She said watching him drag Riley across that parking lot on the security footage broke something in her, made her realize she had to choose her daughters over her fear of him. She thanked the court for taking the violence seriously and asked for the maximum sentence to give her family time to heal without looking over their shoulders. The judge listened to all three statements without interrupting, taking notes occasionally. When they finished, he asked the father if he wanted to make a statement. The father stood, but his lawyer Dorian put a hand on his arm and shook his head. The father sat back down without saying anything. The judge looked at the father for a long moment before speaking. He said he'd reviewed all the evidence, all the testimony, all the documentation of abuse spanning years. He said the father's actions showed a clear pattern of using violence to control his family, and the attempted kidnapping in the parking lot was just the latest escalation. He said Riley's pregnancy didn't excuse the threats or the assault, and the fact that he'd beaten Becca so badly she lost her baby showed exactly how serious his threats were. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison with no possibility of parole for the first 4 years. He also issued a permanent restraining order protecting Riley, Becca, Layla, and their mother, meaning the father couldn't contact any of them even after his release. The father showed no reaction at all, just stared straight ahead like he wasn't even listening. Riley started crying, and her grandmother hugged her tight. The bailiff led the father out in handcuffs, and that was it. He was going to prison. 3 days after sentencing, Rachel called with news about the civil lawsuit. She said Dorian had filed a 1-sentence notice withdrawing the father's appeal of the dismissed lawsuit. With the criminal conviction, there was no way the appeal would succeed, so Dorian was cutting his losses. Rachel said this meant all legal action against me was officially over. No more lawsuits, no more threats, completely done. I felt this huge weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized was still there. The whole thing had been hanging over me for months, this constant background stress, and now it was finally finished. About 3 months after everything started, I got a letter in the mail with Riley's name on the return address. I opened it carefully, not sure what to expect. She'd written several pages in neat handwriting, thanking me for believing her that day in the parking lot when she asked for help. She said most people would have walked away or told her to work it out with her family, but I actually listened and stayed with her even when her dad showed up. She said she'd been in therapy twice a week, working through everything that happened, and her therapist Mara was helping her process years of trauma. She wrote that she was doing better, sleeping more, having fewer panic attacks. She said she was planning to finish high school, that her grandmother had enrolled her in the local school, and she was catching up on credits she'd missed. She sounded hopeful in a way that made me glad I'd gotten involved despite everything it cost. The letter went on for another page describing her current life. She was living with her grandmother in a house that felt safe and quiet, nothing like the chaos and fear of her dad's place. Her sisters Becca and Layla visited often, and the 3 of them were rebuilding their relationship without the constant threat of violence hanging over them. Her mother had left the father officially, filed for divorce, and was also in therapy, working on building a life free from abuse. Riley wrote that she'd decided to keep her baby, that her grandmother was helping her prepare, taking her to doctor appointments, and helping set up a nursery. She said she was scared about being a young mom, but also excited, and she felt like she could actually do this now that she wasn't living in fear. She thanked me again at the end, said she'd never forget what I did, and signed it with her full name, Riley Ann Miles. A week after Riley's letter, I got an invoice from Wallace for his investigation work. I opened it expecting a big number and started calculating how I'd pay it off. But Rachel had already stamped it paid in full with a note saying the attorney fees we'd recovered from the father's sanctions covered everything. Wallace's investigation, Rachel's legal work, all the court costs, everything was paid from the money the judge ordered the father to pay for filing that bogus lawsuit. I didn't owe anything more. I called Rachel to make sure I was reading it right, and she confirmed it, said we actually came out slightly ahead after all the fees were settled. She sounded pleased with herself, said it wasn't often that her clients ended up paying nothing after this kind of legal battle. My boss called me into his office the following week, and I tensed up, remembering his earlier concern about the company being associated with legal controversies. But this time his tone was completely different. He said he'd been following the case in the news, and the company leadership wanted me to know they were proud of how I handled the situation. He said, standing up for someone in danger, especially a kid, reflected well on the company's values, and he apologized for his earlier concern about the legal situation. He said he should have supported me from the start instead of worrying about potential bad publicity. I thanked him and left his office feeling validated in a way I hadn't expected. That evening, my wife and I sat on the couch after dinner and talked about the whole experience. She admitted she'd been absolutely terrified about the lawsuit when it first happened, scared we'd lose our savings or our house trying to defend against it. She said the stress of waiting for the motion to dismiss ruling had kept her up at night, and she'd started looking into second jobs just in case we needed extra money for legal bills. But she also said she was proud of me for not backing down when the father tried to intimidate me into silence with the lawsuit. She said a lot of people would have caved to that pressure, would have refused to testify or tried to settle just to make it go away. She said watching me stick to my principles even when it was scary and expensive made her love me more. We sat there holding hands, and I felt grateful that she'd supported me through all of it, even when she was scared too. 6 months after that day in the parking lot, I went back to the same grocery store to pick up some things for dinner. I was walking out with my bags when I saw Riley and her grandmother near the entrance. Riley was visibly pregnant now, probably 7 months along, and she looked healthy and happy in a way she definitely hadn't that first day. She saw me at the same time, and her face lit up. She walked over with her grandmother and properly introduced us, saying this was her grandmother Helen who'd taken her in. Helen hugged me and said she'd wanted to meet me properly for months, to thank me in person for giving her granddaughter a chance at a safe life. We talked for a few minutes about how Riley was doing. She said school was going well, she was on track to graduate on time despite everything. She talked about the baby coming in 2 months, how she'd set up the nursery at her grandmother's house, how excited and nervous she was about becoming a mom. She talked about her plans for after the baby comes. She wants to go to community college and study social work so she can help other kids who are stuck in bad situations like she was. Her grandmother's face lit up when Riley said this. The older woman put her hand on Riley's shoulder, and you could see how proud she was. Riley stood taller now than she had 6 months ago. She looked me in the eye when she talked instead of staring at the ground. Her voice was steady and sure. She wasn't that scared girl from the parking lot anymore. She'd been through therapy with Mara and was working through everything that happened. Her baby was due in 2 months, and she had a nursery set up and a support system with her grandmother and sisters. She was going to be okay. We said goodbye, and I walked to my car with my grocery bags. As I drove home, I kept thinking about that day at the courthouse when her father smiled at me. I remembered sitting in my car afterward with shaking hands, reading those lawsuit papers over and over. $500,000. I'd thought about how much easier it would have been to just walk past her that day at the store, to mind my own business like so many people do. The lawsuit had been scary and expensive, even with Rachel's help. The stress had kept me up at night for weeks, but sitting in my car now, watching Riley and her grandmother walk into the store together, I knew something for sure. I would make the same choice again, every single time. Because some things matter more than money or convenience or staying out of trouble. Some things are worth fighting for no matter what it costs you.